The world has changed, and we all know in the past 6 to 9 months, and the sort of predictions are that it will not end quickly, and the COVID-19, as we can see here, could push up to 500 million people into poverty in the world. So with all the work that the Sustainable Development Goals are doing, we could have an additional 20% drop in 500 million people in the world. Now, again, the interesting or the sort of important bit is to see where. And of course, it's going to be in East Asia, Pacific, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa as well. This is going to be less, although we will know about it, it will have less impact on Europe and the Western developed countries, but most impact here. This also, as we'll see, is that part of the world that actually produces most of our clothing and a lot of the other products that we trade in the world today and that we want and need. So COVID is going to affect, the Sustainable Development Goals were developed for a beginning in the year 2015, and now we're looking at in the year 2020 another issue like climate change impacted. Now we have COVID-19 impacting, and we have to take a look at, is there anything we can do to lessen that or to be more aware of that? So the first thing I want you to do, this is the first piece of work so that you can sort of start thinking about your place in this, is perhaps think about describing the 3 most significant changes in your life since March 2020, when actual lockdowns and restrictions began to happen. So this is in your life. Like in my life, there have been quite a number. I suppose the most significant for me would have been the fact that I have 2 daughters who live in Melbourne in Australia, and they would have planned to travel and spend the summer with us here in Ireland. That didn't happen. We may have been planning to travel to them in the next 6 months. That's not going to happen. So our sort of family life is reduced to Skype calls, Zoom calls, and the like. So that has been one of the most significant, as well as this reality here. I am now unable to travel this particular month. Donegal's in lockdown, so I can't travel to do the work that I do. So it's becoming an online reality. And then there's the 3 most significant world changes as well. And we know that world economies and world trade and things have been affected dramatically. But for you then, what I want you to do now is, and when you see this slide again, I will ask you to pause, the teacher maybe to pause the presentation, and we call it TDR time. Think about it, think about the 3 changes, the 3 most important things that have affected you during COVID, and then perhaps think about the 3 or 2 or 1, whatever works, things that have affected the world. So think about it, discuss it if you can, either online or with yourselves in the class, and then record your ideas. And this again, you can do yourself, or perhaps you'd like to do it together on a flip chart or on the board or whatever. So these 2 topics, the 3 most significant changes in your life since March 2020, and the 3 most significant world changes since March 2020. So we'll pause for how long it'll take. Let's take, say, maybe 3 to 5 minutes. Might be a good sort of a spell to do, and see how that works for you. And we'll come back then to take a look at where we go next. Okay, so you have collected some ideas collectively and on your own, and we'll refer back to those later. If we move on then, just maybe to take a look at some of the things that have happened in the world, and the sort of some of the positives and negatives that happen. First of all, as we travel less and spend less and produce less during COVID-19, we're demanding less of planet Earth. So there are positives perhaps we can look at. It's not all doom and gloom. There have been reports of reduced carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which will help the whole climate action challenge. There have been, on personal levels, there are people who are connecting more with their locality, with nature, with family, spending more time. And there is less pollution and perhaps less exploitation of people. So there are sort of positives as well coming out of this. Of course, there are many negatives. But one of the challenges we have then is that whatever we learn during this period of COVID-19 and the experience, will we remember it? And our challenge for the future will be to continue to care for the planet and the communities. Can we learn that this has given us an insight into a different way of living? And also, can we sort of take that and use it to live a better life? Like, for example, will we travel less? And these climate change, like there are no flights or very few flights around the world. Will we learn from that this is actually healing the planet? And will we think, you know, perhaps I don't need to fly here and fly there? Will we buy more local? And many people are doing that because they cannot travel distances. And therefore we'll reduce food miles. We'll reduce the amount of food that's been flown and channeled around the world and causing climate change. Will we work from home and commute less? Will we reduce the traffic problems, the pollution problems of the cities? And will we be able to spend more time in our own localities and working? So these are the sort of things that have happened with COVID-19 and perhaps are the challenge for us to see, will we be able to continue those into the future? So we're going to focus particularly in this on one aspect of that future, and that's fashion and clothing. So in looking at fashion and clothing, let's take a look at where in particular these sit within the Sustainable Development Goals. And within the development goals, we're going to look at, I suppose, and reflect on two, SDG 8, Sustainable Development Goal 8, which is about promoting sustained, inclusive, and sustainable and economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. So there are challenges for economic growth. There are challenges, as we all know, for productive employment, where people can't work in their factories and their farms and their offices and all the rest. But above all, can we provide decent work for all people as well? And goal 12, again, is a sort of a catch-all. Is to ensure sustainable consumption and sustainable production patterns around the world. So those things have been challenged by COVID-19, and we want to reflect them. Maybe say they're the goals that we're going to reflect on most. So if in another workshop we take a look at the goals themselves and how we can look at the targets and the statistics that go with them. So let's start off by looking at who makes most of our clothes and who buys most of the world's clothes. It's you know, something that we know that in our present generation we don't really know who makes our clothes. We know where we buy them, but where they come from quite often is something that we're not quite concerned about. So you know, when we go to buy a new shirt, usually we look at the price. Perhaps we look at the fashion, we look at the style, we look at the fit, but rarely do we look at where it was made, who it was made by, and maybe is there any impact? Is there anything about it that I should know? So buying and selling the world's clothes is something we'll look at. The phrase that has been coined for the clothing industry that we live in today and that we work with today is called fast fashion. Now, fast fashion, simply because the amount and the speed at which clothes are produced, demanded, sold, and dumped has become increasingly fast in our world today. A generation or maybe two ago, if you went to a clothing shop and you went in the beginning of the year, the clothing shop would reflect the needs of spring and summer fashions. So you would have all the sort of, at the one time, the clothing stores would stock those particular clothes. And they would stay more or less the same stock of clothes replenished now and again for 4, 5, 6 months of the year. And then coming in to the time of year in August and September, that clothing would be stored, and a new range of clothing would be put in for autumn and winter. Your coats and your scarves and your hats and your woolen jumpers and all of that. That would have changed twice a year, perhaps in the past, in a generation or two generations ago. Now it's quite common that every weekend that you go to a clothing shop, to a shopping mall, that you are going to see new stock. So it's on average now 50 times a year that clothing stores will change the clothing stock that they have. So this means we're producing that much more clothing, we're producing that much more garbage, and we're producing a whole cycle of where clothes are produced, and many of them, as we'll see, are produced in sweatshops and under very poor conditions around the world. We want them cheaper, And that's a whole cycle. If we demand them cheaper, then they have to be produced cheaper, then the resources have to be produced cheaper. We're demanding more choice. You know, the coat that we wore or the shirt that we wore last week, we don't want to wear it again and be seeing it again. So we want to have 3, 4, 5, 10 or whatever shirts, jeans, dresses, whatever that you have. And we take a look at that. We take a look at a little exercise and checking that up. More choice means more sales. So people are buying clothes every weekend and spending more money on clothes. Therefore, the clothes and the fashion means they have a shorter life. We, as I said, wear them perhaps. Many people might just wear clothes for a year and that's gone out of fashion. We want to change them. That means more trash. For example, one garbage truck of clothing is landfilled or incinerated every second. This amount, every second. So we're producing clothing, we're wearing it, we're dumping it, and that has a cycle of negative impacts that begins the whole process again. We've got into this cycle of fast fashion and how it impacts on many, many aspects of the world today, from the people who produce the cotton, to the people who produce the clothing themselves, to the pollution that's caused by it, to the travel, to the flying, to the climate change, right down through to decent work. Because you don't want to pay too much for your clothing, then the people who work in clothing shops don't get paid too much, or the people who produce them don't get paid too much. This is a cycle that we need to look at very carefully. Let's again reflect on yourself. And I've done it too. During the lockdown in your period, wherever you are, have you purchased any clothing? You may have the need for it, for as many clothes because you're not going out so much, but have you bought? And probably if you have, up until recently, it's probably been online, or maybe not. You can talk about that. But if you have bought online, what stores have you used online? Maybe think about that. And what did you use that online store, and why that particular choice? You know, if it was Amazon, if it was Boohoo, if it was Next, if it was whatever, where did you go to buy and why? What are the decisions there? Do you know anything about the store and its background? So if you walk into a real shop, you can see the clothes, you can see the people, you have a sense of who they are. But when you buy online, there is a remoteness. Who are they? Who are Boohoo? Where do they exist? Who are the workers? Who's producing? So the online world has actually changed our notion of where our clothes actually come from. So all of this there are a lot of issues around the whole clothing thing that we need to take a look at. And many of the issues are essentially sustainable development goals. So there is an issue around gender inequality, because most of the clothing industry of the world is driven by women who are more easily employed because they can be employed more cheaply. They're willing to work without trade unions. They're willing to work for lower money. They're willing to work for longer hours, because gender inequality means women do not have the same rights as men and tend to want and tend to try to break out of some sort of cycle of poverty. They're willing to work for less. And companies who produce clothes go to countries where they can exploit that. Responsible purchasing, when we go, how responsible are we about the quality, about the origin, about the fairness of the clothing that we buy? There is, of course, within the whole clothing industry, a child and forced labor element. In many parts of the world where families, where children are exploited simply through economic need. Like, the families are poor and therefore they need to use the whole family workforce, but children are exploited, as are women exploited. And then, of course, in countries where many of the clothing, the articles that we have are made, hazardous substances are used, the dyes, the bleaches, right along through the whole processes. And again, clothing companies will go to countries where they can exploit poor law so that they can use this. So we find that the countries like Cambodia, like Vietnam, like China, who have very large clothing industries, have also got huge problems with the pollution of water from chemical waste, and the pollution of seas from chemical waste, and the dumping into landfill of many of the substances used. Traceability. When again, if I go back to my shirt, the traceability, what's on my shirt to tell me where it comes from? And can I find out where it is? And the clothing industry is full of subcontracting. That means quite often we don't know where our clothes are made. The transparency of when we do go to try and find out, and anyone who has tried to find out about clothing and where it's come from, I've had schools who've worked on many clothing product industries and can't find out exactly where they come. Something as simple as, where does your football kit come from? Where do the GAA clothing needs come from in various ways, and the sports goods? There's not a lot of transparency around it, primarily because there are problems with it, and many of the retailers and the companies and the organizations who use various types of clothing don't want that exposed. The notion of a living wage, people are exploited in the clothing industry. The notion that they should have a wage that at least allows them to live comfortably within their own country. Huge environmental concerns, as I've already mentioned, the concerns about pollution, the concerns about water pollution, soil pollution, air pollution from the production of clothing, then the environmental concerns of transporting them around the world, of flying them, and the impact of carbon dioxide release and climate change. Worker empowerment, the whole notion, and we've been through it in past decades in Ireland, past generations of trade unions and workers' rights, health rights, safety rights, wages rights. That doesn't really exist in the companies who produce the clothing for most of us in the world. And then there's the supply chain. That is, you go into your local store, into Pennies or Dunn's or Next or whatever, and you buy something. And you ask them, well, where did it come from? They'd say, well, it came from a store in England. You go to the store in England, where did it come from? Well, we buy it from Germany. Go to Germany, where did it come from? Well, we actually subcontract to a company in Turkey. And it goes on and on. 20 and 30 different subcontracts, so that it's very difficult to find the end and where goods were actually produced. This was shown dramatically a few years back in a Channel 4 expose of Pennies or Primark in Great Britain, where they followed the production of a dress, a sequin dress, teenage dress that was being sold in the high street in London. And they followed it right down through the supply chains until they got to India, where they found that the program exposed the fact that the dress was actually produced in a sweatshop with children, in very, very poor conditions, and young women in very poor conditions. There was filthy, there were rats, they were locked in, working long hours and all the rest. And it exposed, and it was, very damaging to Primark and them all. Until a year or two later, it was discovered that when the TV company who had followed the supply chain, when they came to India, they couldn't actually find the source. So they invented it. They said, it must be a sweatshop. There must be something wrong. So they set it up for TV, and it was proved to be totally false. So we have to be careful about, where we get our news and where we get the information. We do know that there are huge problems, but we can't just presuppose that these problems are always going to be exactly the same. Improvements are happening. So in COVID-19, what has changed with all those issues? Well, we do know that there's a limited workforce. There are many factories closed. We know that in Ireland. We know that across the world. We know that when you go to shop, there aren't as many clothes available. The winter stock has not arrived. Clothes are still being sold. Summer stock is still being closed. So somewhere again along the supply chain, either the supply has run out, the production has run out, the cotton has run out, all due to COVID-19 restrictions, either in the production, in the farming, or in the transport. So there's limited work, disrupted travel, which means that buyers can't go. It means that suppliers can't travel. It means that the goods can't be moved around as much. Of course, we all know, and you all know, that many retailers have closed. High street traders have closed. And the lucky ones, I suppose, are those who have an online presence, and we can still buy from them. But as you know, many of the retailers, the experience of closing shopping has changed. You can't go into a shop and try on as easily or at all. So it limits your access to clothing. And again, the choice has been curtailed as well. Many retailers just simply can't sustain this. So many small retailers, and unfortunately many local retailers, because they're not backed by a huge organization or unlimited finances, many of the local small shops have closed, which is really problematic. Because of the limited amount of work, we have limited income. We just don't have as much money as we had before. People are either working less, working not at all, limited perhaps to the COVID-19 money from the government, if they qualify for that, and many don't qualify for that. So we don't have the money to spend on the clothing industry that we had before. And of course, for those of you who go out a lot, not so much me, but for those of you who do, why would you dress up anymore? You know, you're not going out as much, so we don't need as many clothes. We're not out and about. We're not going shopping. We're not going out at night. We're not going to the cinema. Unfortunately, it's the reality we've been living in. So that has changed as well. Okay, so it's time for we pause and a bit of think, discuss, record your ideas. So maybe thinking about what has happened, thinking about the issues, what do we know about them? Thinking about particularly this question, clothing. Have you bought? Have you not bought? Have you been online? Have you been to a store? What have you done? And thinking about particularly the overall fast fashion industry that existed before COVID, but it's even worse today. So let's pause again. Let's do another pause time, and we'll have a look. Just think about it, discuss it, those few questions perhaps, or a few ideas, and record your ideas about the world and how it has changed during COVID. And we'll come back shortly with move on to take a look at the world buying and selling of clothes and who actually makes those clothes that you're no longer wearing or you're no longer able to buy either in the store or online. Okay, let's move on. In the world today, let's take a look briefly at who buys the clothes of the world and who sells them. And these two maps are from a very excellent website. If you like your statistics visually rather than in rows of figures, as I do, and it's called worldmapper.org, where it takes statistics in the world, like for example the one on the left, the clothing imports, and it shows the map of the world. You can see very clearly. You can see North America here. You can see South America, Africa, and all. You can see Australia. And it expands them depending on how much of this particular thing it does. So there are many, many world mapper statistics. This one easily shows that most of the world's clothing imports are the United States, Europe, perhaps, and some of China. There's a breakdown then of many of the statistics if you want to go into it further, but it's quite obvious. That's who buys. Who sells? China, India, Pakistan, countries of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam are countries who produce many of our clothes. Eastern Europe as well. And then, as you can see, North America, South America, the Sub-African contract Europe produced very, very few clothes. So we basically have a situation where Southeast Asia and the East produces our clothes and the West buys the clothes. That's the reality of the buying and selling of it. Who makes them though? These are the people who make your clothes, whether they're in the Philippines, whether they're in Bangladesh or India. They're made primarily, and it's very obvious, by young women, again, as I said, who are employed usually on very low wages, usually because there is very little other employment, and quite often supervised, as you can see in the picture, in this picture on the right from India, by men. So it's a very gender unequal distribution of who makes your clothes. Now, this is not new. I live in Donegal, and in past generations, the clothing factories of Derry across the border provided employment for thousands of people, mainly women, to go to the shirt factories, to go to the other clothing factories in Northern Ireland, based on a whole tradition of linen and clothing manufacture. And it was that. But again, it was about the production of clothes at a cheaper rate so that they could be sold cheaply as well. So just reflect on that. Like, who is making your clothes? Primarily young women, primarily, let's say, working under less than average conditions and less than average wages and conditions right around the world. There are many campaigns to highlight this, and this is one of them, a campaign called I Made Your Clothes. And it just basically takes a look at people around the world, whether they're people in Eastern Europe, whether they're people in Africa, whether they're people in the Philippines, all around the world, people are making your clothes, but primarily people in Southeast Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Cambodia, those countries as well. Those are the people who are making your clothes. At one time, clothes 2 or 3 generations ago in Ireland, clothes were made locally. You went to the local seamstress to get a coat or a dress made. You went to the local tailor to get trousers or to get a winter jacket or a winter coat or a suit made or whatever. There was a very close link between the people in the locality and the production of clothing in the locality. At its biggest in places like Donegal, the actual material came. Tweed was made from wool, which came from the sheep. And linen was grown as flax in Northern Ireland and produced the cloth linen, which was made into shirts and things like that. There was a really close connection, and therefore we valued and knew the connection between those who made our clothes and ourselves. And we were willing, I think, then to pay a reasonable price, because we knew that the people who made them were expert at doing it, and we were willing to pay that price to give them the living they needed. Now we've become disconnected. We don't know who makes our clothes. Again, back as I said to my shirt, I don't know. It's very difficult on the labeling to see where it was made and who made it. And I don't have a connection with them, and therefore perhaps I don't value their work. This might show us exactly why. It would be quite common for a dress to be made, for 60 cents, dollars or euro, whatever, and sold for $50. That gap between the production and the retail price is huge, and we have to really take a look at who is making the money out of all of this, and why is the production so cheap. Primarily because the material has been produced cheap, and the people who produce the clothing, either the material or the clothing itself, are not being paid well. We're disconnected with them. We should really try and make that connection to see who is making my clothes. Who are these people, and what do I want for them? A decent living. It's our global connection with them. And if I want a decent living for them, then I have to be able to bridge this gap. Someone has to check what's the problem between how much we're paying people to produce our clothes and how much we're willing or asked or forced to pay to buy them. So important questions for us. And when you end up on, as we say, the high street, have a look at this and say, like, where are these clothes coming from? What am I paying, and who am I paying? Is it for a flashy shop front and for the people who have invested money in the production of this? Is it the fashion industry? Is it clothes designers? Their lifestyle is quite elaborate, and are they getting the money? Is the company investors and the banks getting the money? Certainly in all of this, one of the things that is happening is that the people who produce our clothes are not getting the money. The farmers who farm cotton are not getting our money. The people who are sewing, bleaching, dyeing, and all are not getting our money. And along the supply chain, there are people who are very poorly paid. So an investigation maybe into that will reveal that most of the profit stays in the West, even though most of the clothes and the materials are made in the East and in the less developed countries. So maybe another little pause just to sort of think about that. Think about who's making my clothes, what sort of life should they have? Should I be part of that exploitation? Can I do anything about it? Perhaps. What would I be willing to pay for a T-shirt or a pair of jeans or a dress or whatever, so that those people could have a decent living? Or perhaps take a look at, could we connect more with clothing produced at home? Is that possible? So we'll take a short pause again, just to see where that is, and we'll be back again and move on. Okay, we're back again. You've had a bit of a think, a bit of a discuss, and you've recorded some ideas about clothing and who makes it and how much they get for it and where we buy it and how we buy it, and there are changes we can make. I want to move on now a little bit and take a look at some of the bigger issues in terms of clothing production, and in particular the question of cotton. Most of the clothing that we wear today, whether it's your shirts, your t-shirt, your underwear, your jeans, are all begin as cotton. It's a very useful material. It can be made very lightweight. It's very adaptable. It can be dyed easily, etc. But it's a huge world industry, and right from the times back in the 1800s when cotton was developed, it became associated with the slave trade. The cotton industry of southern states of America and the Caribbean was associated with the production of cotton through black slave trade from Africa. And it was a notorious trade where traders who wanted to import cotton from America would travel, first of all, from Europe, from England, from France, from Germany, from Holland, or whatever, down into Africa. They would trade and buy people, buy slaves, transport them across the Atlantic, sell them to unscrupulous landowners, mainly, again, European landowners, who would then own these people and work them until they died. And the slave trade became notorious in this. And the association then of cheap clothing really is still with us. And when we talk today about employing young women or employing child labor, it's a sort of a continuation of a notion that the clothing industry, it's as if it said it had some right to exploit people. But anyway, cotton, and this is cotton, it grows as a plant, a natural plant, and has to be picked. But as you can see too, it's quite a thorny plant, and it's a difficult job, and it has to be done quite often by hand. And these pictures are from former Soviet states where cotton is picked by hand. So it's a fairly backbreaking job. And as you can see here, young women, men, families, children, all working on it. Most of it on state-owned farms or on large plantation farms. There are very few parts of the world where cotton is produced on a small scale and within the control of the farmers. So again, there's an exploitation of workers. There is, of course, in more developed parts of the world, in America now, there is mechanized cotton harvesting and planting and all the rest. But that has come with its own problems. And one of the problems has been that because, as you can see, it's very dense, the production of cotton, weeds grow and it's very difficult to control those weeds. So cotton is sprayed with a lot of weed killer. And there is a circle of issues around this weed killer that has developed around the world today. Has become infamous. And that is the production by a company called Monsanto of their weed killer called Roundup. Now, a little connection here, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to explain. Monsanto began genetically modifying seeds back in the 1980s. And the genetic modification they were concerned about is that they wanted to develop a cotton production that they could spray with a weed killer that wouldn't get into the cotton and do it any damage. So they got into genetic modification of the seed, so that the genetic modification was that the seed would not take up the Roundup. So you could spray the crop, but the cotton would be okay. You know, it might go into the ground, it would kill the weeds, it might do harm, but it wouldn't get into the crop. This was very important for Monsanto at the time because it wasn't just cotton. They also wanted to be able to use the same process of weed killing in corn, in soya, and in many other crops that are grown, particularly in the United States. And that's where a lot of the problems today are. So if you can imagine, now I buy seed that's genetically modified by Monsanto, and if I spray it with Roundup to kill the weeds 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 times during its season, the cotton will be fine. Now that's okay if you can afford the whole process of buying the seed and the Roundup to kill the weeds. But it's not okay if you live in a very poor part of the world where actually you might be able to buy the seed, but you can't actually afford this whole process. So governments have been lobbied by Monsanto to encourage farmers to take up their process. That is a genetically modified seed and this weed killer called Roundup. What it has meant is that farmers have to spend more on their production and therefore have to make more money. And if the crop isn't good enough, or the people making clothes don't want to pay for the cotton or pay enough as it changes from year to year, farmers can lose out a lot. At its worst in southern India, there have been huge numbers of suicides by small-scale farmers working in the cotton production who have gone so much into debt by buying this seed and buying this Roundup and finding actually that the world price of cotton has gone down. They're making no money, they've gone into debt, and honors suicides have become unfortunate reality of the cotton industry. Also, the production and the cost of this has sent the price again of clothing and the price of cotton up as well. More importantly, I suppose, if we moved away from, and we'll take a look at that maybe in a different workshop, when we use this process with the food we eat, then it becomes even more serious. But it's a very difficult problematic sort of process to deal with this, and we'll take a look at more detail. But if we take a look at the whole process then and where it's happening, who's producing cotton in the world, we'll see that most of the world's cotton is produced by China. And again, there are huge issues in China on human rights, on forced labor, on enforced labor, on the transport of people around and again, China, the poverty in Chinese rural areas producing cotton is very, very high. India, again, a quarter nearly of the whole world's production, and this is a country of a subcontinent of 1 billion people, where the agriculture that's associated with cotton is very, very stressed and very poverty prone as well. Some of it's still produced, maybe 15% produced in the United States, but again, Pakistan, Brazil, Uzbekistan, which was the country we saw earlier on in the former Soviet Republic, all these relatively underdeveloped countries or countries under stress and economic stress are producing our cotton. So that's where the raw material is coming from. And that's important to remember. So the supply chains and where the cotton is coming from then gets into the whole area of knowing where our food or our cotton comes from and our particular clothes are coming from. And we're going to take a look perhaps at that supply chain. Do we know where the cotton is coming from? Is child labor involved? And we're going to take a look at jeans, a standard ordinary pair of blue jeans, and maybe do a little survey and a little think about that. And we're going to take a look perhaps at one of the companies that people have often labeled as unethical and part of the fast fashion, that's Pennies. But actually Pennies have their own ethical cotton range. Interesting to take a look at, and we learn a little bit more about cotton and what's ethical cotton and how Pennies actually are allowed to label, quite rightly so, their cotton as ethical and what it is. And we're going to take a look at water, because that's one of the other stress factors that's involved in this industry as well. So again, time for a little just, do we know anything about the issues we've talked about? Do you know about cotton? Do you know what just take a look at some of the clothing that we have. Do we know about cotton? Where's denim coming into this? Because it is just another type of cotton. Have you ever seen Roundup? Have you ever used Roundup? Do you know anything about it at all? And Monsanto, have you heard about Monsanto and the connection between Roundup, that weed killer, and perhaps the demise of the bees around the world, because the particular type of chemical in Roundup, glyphosate, is very harmful to bee colonies. Do you know anything about that? So again, just a quick pause this time, perhaps, to see, to discuss, to think, discuss, and record a few ideas about cotton, about Monsanto, about Roundup, about bees, about where cotton comes from, and we'll come back then with a look at water. Okay, short break there, and let's come back now with taking this just a little bit further. And here's just another angle on the clothing industry that's interesting to imagine as well, and there's something I'll take up in another workshop about consumption. But if you take a look at this is just from world water issues, and take a look at here. It takes over 10,000 liters of water to make one pair of jeans. That's a huge amount of water. 10,000 liters of water to make one pair of jeans. You may know those people in rural areas will know what a 1,000 liters looks like. It's one of those white plastic containers that often are on farms for storing water. And 10 of those it would take, that's 10 cubic meters of water to make one pair of jeans. Vast amounts of water, but it does come from irrigating the cotton. It comes from bleaching, it comes from the chemical processes in it, it comes from the dyeing of them, it comes from all the processes right through cotton to produce denim to make one pair of jeans. So think about that, water. And again, here are a few things we'll come back to again. You'll probably see this diagram in some of the other workshops I do as well. Let's just focus on jeans and that 10,000 liters. So here are a few facts about it. Half of all the world's jeans are made in China. It takes a kilogram of cotton to make a pair of jeans. So take a pair of your jeans, put them on the kitchen scales. That's about a kilogram of cotton. So it takes about 10,000 liters of water to make one pair of jeans. Now, just contemplate that, think about that. Where is the water coming from to make your clothes? It's not from Ireland. Every shirt, t-shirt, pair of jeans that we wear is actually using, polluting, dumping millions and millions of liters of water in China, in Uzbekistan, in India, in Pakistan, in Vietnam, Cambodia, all around the world. In other words, countries that are already stressed with water are donating huge amounts of their water supplies and under pressure from factories or governments to supply factories with the water. Instead of for home use and for other food use, it's producing cotton. And cotton is a very, water hungry plant, particularly in India when this figure can go up to 20,000 liters. So all of that cotton denim industry is robbing and using water around the world, again, for our use. It's not whatever about the child labor and the other issues and pollution issues, but simply we are abusing and taking a huge amount of the world's water into the clothing industry. We'll just pause there a moment, sorry. So the water aspect is also something that we have to consider, but also then taking a look, moving on then to the workers, as you can see here, and many of the conditions under which workers work at the clothing industry are like this as well. A lot of the clothing industry is farmed out to villages and to small sort of communities for what's called piecework. If you're maybe not familiar with it, it's where instead of paying people for a week's work, as they might in a factory, but even in factories this happens, you get paid for every piece of clothing that you are successful in producing. So the more you produce, and that means getting more of your family and younger people involved. Communities are forced to work harder, work longer hours, because they only get paid for what they produce, piecework. Often that's the case as well in many factories, that although you may be sitting in a factory and maybe not in conditions like this, you only get paid for the amount of clothing that you actually produce. So there is a huge pressure on the workers within the clothing industry to work long hours to produce the clothes they need. And then thinking, what effect has COVID-19 had on the clothing workers? You know, apart from all the sort of stresses and strains, the sickness of COVID, the deaths that have happened, the times of not being able to work, and the stresses on the clothing industry itself. and then think, who's responsible for that? Who's going to look after these people, particularly in countries where it is not going to be easy for the government and developing countries to actually do anything about this. This was shown to a great degree in Bangladesh 4 or 5 years ago about who's responsible. You may or may not know about the situation of Rana Plaza, which was a clothing factory in Bangladesh. And this was the part of the factory here. Literally, the factory collapsed. 2013, 1,138 garment workers were killed and 2,500 more were injured. It was the deadliest, the biggest disaster in the history of the global apparel industry, of the clothing industry. So I would ask you the first thing, did you ever hear about it? The biggest clothing industry disaster in the world. Did you or your teacher ever hear about Rana Plaza? And if so, or if not, why? Is it because the people that are behind the fashion and the clothing industry don't want us to know that the factories they built are cheap, that the care they take of the workers is not very, very well, not very good? And what happened? So what happened in the wake of that is that the media attention focused on the brands who were being supplied from from the Bangladeshi industry, and reform that was needed in that. Some companies, yeah, they actually stepped up to the mark. The company that shines out among all this is that high street store we saw earlier, H&M. They actually said that they would do a full audit of all the factories who produce for them, a full audit of all the supply chains, and they have done that. Many others have not, have ignored it. And companies like Next and companies like Walmart and others around the world just simply refuse. H&M and other companies have actually paid money into funds to look after the families of the dead and the injured workers. Other companies have not. So there is care in the clothing industry, there is change, but there are also companies who really don't care about it. But fortunately for us, there are people who are very concerned about this fashion change in this fashion industry, and who follow up on this. So here's what's called the COVID-19 tracker. These are companies who, since the pandemic has happened, have decided to look after the companies who they promised to pay. So in the pre-COVID, there would have been orders placed for clothing from around the world. Since COVID, a lot of those orders cannot be fulfilled. The clothing stores are closed, they can't supply them. So who's done the right thing and committed to pay for the orders placed so that workers get their money? Adidas, ASOS, H&M, Lululemon, Marks and Spencer's, Next, some of them quite good. But others have made no commitment to pay. For example, Topshop, C&A, right? JCPenney, which is the American and nothing to do with our Pennies or Primark. Levi Strauss and others. Well, there's Primark again. There's more information than that, which you can find out more about this and perhaps do a little bit of research on it. That some companies, again, the clothing companies, have been very good in paying for the orders and hoping they will be delivered whenever. Others have not. And it's the same as with Rana Plaza. There are those companies who have an ethical background and want to support the workers and the industry, and those who do not. Changes have happened, and there is improvement. 130 companies in 2019, just before the pandemic struck, had actually made changes and moved up the scale. But 7 companies receiving an A+ for having done great work in their clothing industry. 17 companies are receiving an F. You'll understand that at school. You want an A+ or an F. And this has been tracked by an ethical fashion report. And this report, by the way, I will have emailed separately to your teacher. And you can do a bit of research on this ethical fashion report and find out more about it. Also, if you're interested in this whole area, the Ethical Consumer website is very good. It's a UK-based website that follows companies, and it's not just the clothing companies that I've taken here, but many other companies, to see how ethical they are. So if you're buying, for example, from H&M and Levi Strauss and Company, up to last year, they were the top. They were the most ethical, looking after the workers, looking after the environment, etc., and doing things like that. At the bottom, where some very, very high-end brands like Chanel, very, very poor in terms of looking after equality and workers and health and safety and pay and all the rest. Claire's Accessories, Prada, like very expensive brands. And some of the others like Primark and Adidas moving up in terms of their ethical concerns about the workers that they're working with. So we can make decisions about this. This is when we come to the end. Who do we buy from? We may not be able to follow the trend in our own clothing and where we bought it from, but certainly there are websites and there are organizations who will do this work for us. And then we make the decision. I'm going out to buy a pair of jeans. Do I go to Claire's Accessories? Do I go to Hugo Boss? Do I go to, where do I go to buy my clothes? Topshop, Mango. Or do I go to Levi Strauss? What you're paying for is ethical concern for the people and the planet. If you buy this end, you just want something cheap. So let's take a look. Let's pause just for a moment before we take a look then at reimagining the clothing stores of the future. What's going to happen? And I'll ask you again, maybe just to pause shortly and have a look at these couple of questions here, these couple of notions of the clothing industry. Before you decide to buy something new or in your clothing that you have, use it up. Have you made any use of it that you can? Have you worn it out? Will it make do? Or can you do without? There's simple actions that you can take a look at. And you might then, you might just have a look at these. And maybe we'll do another quick, short pause. Think about that. Using it up, wearing it out, making it do, or just do without it. Can we do that? Think about it. A bit of a discussion. Record your ideas. We'll do a short pause again. And we'll come back then. We're on the last leg of this. One more section to do. One more TDR time before we finish the workshop today. Okay, what can we do? Each one of us can make a difference, either in ourselves or we can make a difference in how we campaign, how we get together and do things. One of the simplest things to do is just consume less. Do we need to buy the amount of clothing that we buy? Have we used it? Have we reused it? Have we swapped it before we've thrown it away, particularly thrown it away into landfill? Okay, so before you go out then and buy new, do you need something? Can you do without? Will you actually use it? I'm sure many of you have come home with the shopping from the clothes shops, thrown the stuff out on the bed and haven't looked at it, hung it up, and maybe 6 months later you go back and say, oh, there's that t-shirt or shirt or blouse or whatever that I bought. God, I've never even worn that. And it goes off to recycling or whatever. And then have a think about it, what's going to happen when you finish it? Particularly if you put it into landfill, and that huge mound we saw earlier on, that load of garbage every second in the world that's dumped, we do need to stop that. So just consume less. It's a really good idea to try and think of shopping locally. When we shop locally, particularly with local suppliers and local producers, it has a lot of benefits. First of all, we're reconnecting with the people who actually produce and who retail, and our connection with them is not something across the world. We know what their standard of living is. We're willing to, they're our neighbors and friends, and we're willing to work with them. Whereas if you're simply shopping online, you have no connection with workers, with retailers, with who's benefiting from it at all. So think about shopping locally. shopping locally can reduce, if when we're back into post-COVID times, the car use and where we're going, and it's a production or a pollution reduction method as well. Now, you might find it harder to find more ethical brands, but the great thing is if you ask, sometimes you can persuade your shop to stock them. Mainly retailers will stock what sells. If we ask them, and if we're willing to buy ethically, they will stock them. I remember in another campaign going to my local Aldi, and it was around Fair Trade Week, and I asked them about accessing fair trade flowers, and they said, "Well, we can access fair trade flowers. We can have fair trade flowers in 2 days' time if people want them. So if you want us to stock fair trade flowers, just ask us. We'll get them." So don't be afraid to go to your clothing shop in your local shop and say, "You know what, if we could get some ethically produced jeans, we might buy more of them, or we'll buy from you rather than going online." Just remember that the price you pay for a pair of jeans or whatever it is you want to buy has an ethical background. It's not just money, it's people's lives, it's pollution, it's exploitation, it's child labor, it's inequality. So paying a little more means you are helping more people. Stands to sense. It's sort of a no-brainer. Recycling and secondhand. You don't always have to buy new. Recycle, and there's lots and lots of charity shops and lots of people who specialize in this, who love the charity shop and the recycling and all the rest. It's great fun. And again, ethical consumer will help you in sort of buying ethically. I do know of one locally, again, one group of girls who set up their own recycling online shop during COVID by just simply advertising and showing the clothes that they had, and they couldn't get out to buy more. They didn't have the money, they had no part-time jobs, and they have a thriving online secondhand shop among themselves. So why not with your perhaps your cousin in another town where you at least won't see the same clothes that you wore last week? Move them around. So recycling, be inventive about it. I'm sure you can. And then after the doing, there's the campaigning. Join together, start a campaign. Something as simple as develop a postcard at school, send it to your local clothing shop, send it to your Pennies, your Duns, or whatever, and ask them, would they stock, or what is their position on something? Ask them to try and become perhaps more ethically aware, and that you promise to shop with them if they do. Local TDs, local chambers of commerce and things like that can be asked to participate in ethical shopping. Many towns around the country, including local ones here like Carndonagh and Moville, the towns there have taken up fair trade status, and that is very important as well, because that means that within the town there is a commitment by shops, by producers and all, to stock fair trade and ethical goods. So that can be a great help as well. So think about ways that you can campaign, perhaps as an individual, perhaps as a group, either to your retailer or to the people you buy from. Well, maybe it's the online stores, maybe it's the company you buy from, maybe it's the label that you like or whatever, but campaign, ask people to make a difference, and sometimes they will. So maybe it's time for a little promise or two from you, just to see where we're going. We have only another couple of slides left here. What will you do in the future fashion? Will you learn more about your clothing origins? Take a look at the labels, check it out. Buy less. Do you need it? Try buying less. Maybe foreign to some of you, but you can sew buttons back on, you can mend holes, you can or do the opposite, mend your clothes. You can rip your jeans, and the ones that don't have rips. Do things with your clothes yourself. It's really interesting, and for some of you, in art and social and scientific and others, it's a great pastime. And for those of you interested, it's a career move as well. So get into adapting, changing, mending, swapping and exchanging, as I've already said. And then take a look at fair trade and ethical brands. Do a little bit of research. among the class and among the group and say, okay, let's find out who makes the best and the most ethical jeans or t-shirts or sneakers, runners, or whatever, and say, well, there, let's advertise that and see what we can do ourselves. Will we buy more of those? Then there's the bigger question, will the world, and these are the campaigning ones perhaps, will the world reduce the demand for fast fashion? Can we help to reduce the demand? And really, this is something we can model by ourselves, but we really need to join together, join campaigns, join movements that are going to do something about this. Something if you don't do, none of this will work. That is, will you value the clothing workers with better pay conditions and health and safety? Do you value those people around the world who produce your clothes? If you don't make that global connection, they're people, they're our family, they're teenagers just like us. If you do, then you will make great changes in your life. But if you don't value the people, you'll continue to exploit them. So you're either part of the problem, but if you sit in the fence, you are part of the problem, or you're part of the solution. So do you want to be part of the problem, part of the solution? Look at cotton and look at where it's coming from. You can help reduce the pesticides and the herbicides in the cotton farming. By doing any of these things, you are going to help the planet environmentally. And then make supply chains transparent. Maybe a project, maybe something to trace. I've suggested before, it could be your school uniform, it could be your sports gear, it could be your pair of jeans, it could be whatever. And maybe just make a decision to, okay, we're going to trace one of these and see how far down the supply chain can we go to find out where and who actually makes the clothing that I am wearing. This is our last pause before we round up. So what will you promise to do? What's going to come out of this awareness about the fashion industry, about the effect that COVID has had in pushing more people into poverty? And what can we do about the lessons we've learned from COVID about supporting people around the world, and the fact that COVID is a pandemic. The fashion industry is a pandemic. It affects everyone in the world. So we take just our last pause before our last two slides. Okay, I just want to finish off by any of you who are really interested in this and taking a look at one idea that has happened that you might like to think about joining in or whatever else. Following, as I said, the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh and what has happened there, there are a lot of the fashion industry people who are concerned about the ethics of all of this have taken a step to establish what's called the Fashion Revolution Week. And there's a campaign and an organization called Fashion Revolution. Perhaps you'd like to join, perhaps you'd like to find out more about it. And they have a week during the 24th of April. Now, again, with COVID and next year, I don't know what's going to happen this, but it's the anniversary. It's the date of the Rana Plaza collapse. It's very significant to have something happening in that week of the 24th of April each year to remind us that the people who produce our clothes should be taken care of by us. So have a look at Fashion Revolution Week, and perhaps it's something you can do a little bit more research about, and something that you might like to join, and maybe have something happen within your school during that week. And there's lots and lots of backup and information. They have regular suggestions and campaigns and information going out that perhaps you would like to get involved in. So have a look at that. So that's it for this workshop, taking a look at the fashion industry, fast fashion, taking a look at the extra pressure on the world through COVID-19, taking a look at the possibilities that we can change within the fashion industry, this global industry that really can harm a lot of people or perhaps could support a lot of people. It has brought home to us a lot during COVID-19 because of the pressure both on workers who cannot work, on the supply chains who cannot supply, on the retailers who can't open, and on us who can't get out to buy clothes anymore. But perhaps it's given us a breather. Let's think of that. It's given us a little bit of time, as in many things during COVID-19, to think about the world we live in and say, I wonder, could it be better? I wonder, could we change it? I wonder, could we think about the world in a different way? So until next time, perhaps you might like to record some of this. If you're interested, I will connect back in with you for questions and answers. And if not, I'm sure I'll hear more from you on this, and I'll join you again for other workshops. So for now, from me, Patsy Toland in Donegal, thanks very much and see you again.